Welcome back. Our next speaker today is Sydney Elaine Butler, founder at Accessible Creates. Sydney, welcome to the Global Inclusion Online Forum. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm good. It's early in the morning, but I'm good. And where I am and where you are again, but I'm good. Thank you.
So Sydney's understanding is that their professional purpose must be to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to be successful, regardless of barriers on their way, and they must, as professional, remove these barriers. So today, Sydney will focus in their presentation on how to organize recruitment and empowerment for neurodivergent people in a big corporate workplace. This is actually going to be the topic of our main panel discussion of this section in just an hour, but I believe that will be a great introduction into the topic by Sydney. And before I pass the floor to you, I just want to remind our attendees who have just connected to the platform, you can ask your questions in the chat whenever you want to, and I will be back after the presentation to help Sydney handle the questions. So welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. So yes, how to organize recruitment and empowerment for neurodivergent people in a big corporate workplace. So I'm going to give you a bit of an agenda today. So first, we're going to talk about recruitment, then inclusive interviewing tips and tools and strategies. And then once you actually hire the candidate, how to empower them once they're in the workplace, and then having inclusive policies and procedures. And then it's time for Q&A. So you want to hire a neurodiverse candidate. So right now there's a lot of barriers to recruitment in the recruitment aspect for neurodiverse individuals. A lot of people think there's only, excuse me, I'm gonna take a sip of water quickly. A lot of people think there's only recruitment barriers for people with physical disabilities. However, with neurodivergent candidates and employees, there's a lot of barriers that come with recruitment. And especially in the recruitment process, there's a lot of unconscious bias in recruitment and barriers in the way that include the language used in job postings, not welcoming inclusive talent. Even though your company might welcome inclusive talent, it's not showing that it welcomes inclusive talent. And we've seen that a lot in companies, because they want to be inclusive and they would hire people with disabilities and they're neurodivergent. They're just not very clear about that. So it starts with a recruitment interview and hiring process. It's important to understand your barriers at your specific workplace and your industry, and then removing these barriers. However, with it just starts off by removing the general barriers that exist to people that are neurodivergent, which include, again, the job postings, using company lingo, because a lot of people don't understand the company lingo or the industry lingo if they're not directly in the industry, and you use more plain language. And so that's by removing that barrier and ensuring your website is up to WCAG guidelines to ensure accessibility. A lot of barriers come in the actual website. So there's now a lot of companies are realizing the importance of accessibility in the workplace and in the postings. However, sometimes our website is not accessible, not up to date with accessibility, because they say that the website has been working efficiently for so long and that they're getting the candidates they want if they post the job ads and job descriptions on the website. However, they're not accessible for people with disabilities. So ensuring that's up to date at all times. Having an accommodation statement for candidates. A lot of people think accommodation, they think of physical disabilities again, like removing the physical barriers. So someone that uses a wheelchair, removing those physical barriers for them, removing those non-physical barriers, and having those accommodations in place, and allowing a candidate to know that they can ask for accommodation anytime. It's important to recognize that with this as well, they won't always ask for accommodation and don't want to disclose that they need accommodation in the interview process, or they just don't need accommodation during the interview process, but once they actually get hired. But having an accommodation statement in place and accommodation can look from providing the questions ahead of time. This is a thing that more companies should be doing. There's some companies that are doing it, and then they end up getting the good results and seeing that they're getting more diverse candidates and they're getting better answers from their candidates and getting to know the candidates more, and their personality shines more because they allowed that time to prepare the questions ahead of time. Modifying job postings to be more accessible and use inclusive language. So I kind of touched on this already, but again, removing that company lingo and that jargon, because a lot of people don't understand what it means, and just using plain language of what the job duties entail, and just being really plain and clear with what you expect, and not using fancy language to dress it up. Making sure that your company welcomes neurodiverse talent. So attend events to learn how to become more inclusive to neurodiverse talent. Do the research, get certified. There's now the Neurodiversity in Business, is a UK-based business, and they're helping companies get certified, saying that they're a partner, and so this shows that you're welcoming neurodiverse talent. So how to conduct an inclusive interview. So a lot of companies, right now we're using companies of mostly remote, not all companies, again, because we're going back to in-person or hybrid models, but a lot of companies are still using video conferencing tools to make the interviewing process more accessible, and it's easier for them, and so it's easier for candidates as well to interview for these positions. And so asking if any accommodations are needed before the interview, but having that accommodation statement is important, because then it allows you to prepare ahead of time to how to accommodate them. And during the interview, you should just ask everyone, and companies that do ask, do you have accessibility needs, or they don't have to disclose that they're neurodivergent or have autism or have ADHD, but just say they require accessibility needs, which is accommodation, and require a little more accessibility to be successful in the interview. And by successful, I mean just doing well in the interview. It doesn't mean they necessarily get the job, but they get to best show who they are and what they would bring to the team. And so if they say yes, then, accommodate them as they need, or, provide accessible options and have those accessible options ready, and do a lot of research, and understand what accessibility needs look like for that specific job that you're hiring for at that time, because it could look very different depending on if you're an entry-level position or a management level position, and the type of questions that are being asked, and the testing that you want to conduct. It is not right to ask for a disability if they say they require accessibility needs, or if you, some people think they can suspect that someone has a disability, but you can never tell if someone's neurodivergent. But say, if you need any help, I'm here to help. A lot of companies that don't ask for your disability, because even if you know the disability or know that they're neurodivergent or not, it doesn't really matter. But it's important to just help everyone, and help them how they best need help. The companies that are doing this seem to have a more success rate and have more higher productivity that we've seen, because they not focusing on the condition of the disability, they're focusing on the person and how they can directly help that person, which makes the person feel more comfortable. It makes the person feel like they can do their work more efficiently. Again, accommodations. So during the interview, it could be as simple as just checking in and being like, how are you finding the interview so far? And really assuring them, and just checking in on how they're doing during the interview, because the interviews can be nerve-wracking. And then check in more or less. So, when they ask for accessibility, if they say they need accessibility needs, ask if they need check-ins, and then, how often they need check-ins, or, check in how they're feeling beforehand, before the interview. So, because they're probably really nervous before the interview. And then after they conclude the interview, ask them how they feel after, because it allows them to reflect on how they felt. And, and then it's important, just the human aspect, and having closed captions available for all virtual interviews. So a lot of companies actually, I work as a consultant and a speaker for a lot of companies, and I see that they're still not using virtual, for the virtual interviews, or just meetings in general. They're not having closed captions enabled. And it's 2022, we've been in the pandemic and working virtual for a while. So it's important to have closed captions enabled at all times, because you never know who's going to need them. And if you don't have closed captions enabled, this actually hinders the ability to come across some points in both the interview and in the office, or when you're actually working in these positions, because some people need that written instruction and written words so they can better understand and process what's being said. So if you don't have closed captions enabled, it can be very much of a detriment to the interview process, and so you might not get the answers that you were looking for because you didn't have closed captions enabled. And we've seen that a lot of companies have struggled saying they couldn't find candidates or they didn't find the right candidates, and then it's like, did you have closed captions enabled? And they're like, they didn't have it automatically enabled at all times. So it does make a difference. So again, providing questions when requesting for interview, having the questions and sharing those questions when you're requesting an interview for the candidate so they can review the questions ahead of time. And it's points, like for example, like when you're doing a test or an exam for school, you have time to prepare because you have the content usually. So it's the same thing, having the questions ahead of time and sharing them when you're requesting the interview. Be like, hey, we want to welcome you to an interview at such and such a time, and providing the questions ahead of time so it allows them time to prepare and allows them to better answer the questions and be more comfortable when they're in the moment because they don't have to think on their feet. And I know it's important to think on your feet at work sometimes, but you also have a lot of time to prepare at work, and it allows for everyone to shine better. And also rephrasing questions as needed. So sometimes I've been in interviews and companies didn't rephrase the question, and sometimes it's important to rephrase the question because someone might not understand what you mean. The words you use, again, that goes back to the fancy language and just plain language versus plain language, and having the questions asked in a way that allows the person to best answer the question. Use inclusive language, understand that some of the language you might use is not inclusive and that it might create barriers or might have. So some companies companies that don't use inclusive language are wondering why they don't get inclusive candidates and they don't get people that they want to hire, people with disabilities, neurodivergent individuals, people from diverse backgrounds. And so it's important to use inclusive language and, understand and use that and say you welcome diversity and inclusion and how you welcome diversity and inclusion. Provide adequate time to answer the question. Some companies, they're just in a rush to conduct the interviews. And I know in the big corporate world, we rush. But if you want to ensure you get the best candidate and, allow adequate time to answer the question. And maybe usually before you do the interview, ask how long does it take you to answer a normal question? Or so you have an idea. So then, you can provide that space and provide that time. And you don't, you're not rushed. And then you have usually an interview is only an hour, but still providing the adequate time to answer the question or modifying the interview time is needed if they need more time. Ensuring the person understands the questions that are being asked. So a lot of companies, they don't ensure that you understand the questions being asked. They just ask you the question, but then the person feels obligated to feel like they understand and answer the question they best understood the question. But do you understand the question? If you care enough to ask, do you understand the question? They'll care enough and be more comfortable enough to be like, actually, I didn't understand the question. Can you please rephrase it? And allows for more, even if it's, just for the interview, just creating that more of a connection, breaking down those barriers and those communication barriers that might exist. So we've seen companies that, if you don't ask that question, you could get an answer to a question and it could be aligned to what the question was asking, but it could be kind of off base, so just asking, do you understand the question? And it goes back to rephrasing the question as needed. So if they didn't understand the question, rephrase the question in a way they understand. And conduct all interviews in the same way, if it's for the same position, usually, have the same order of questions. It's not fair when, even if you have a candidate that has a disability or is neurodivergent, it's important that you still conduct the interview the same way you conducted with another candidate, because if you if you change the order of the questions, then it could get confusing. And when you go back to review, you'll be all over the map and I understand and then the question, because the flow is different when you change the order of the questions or you change something in the interview, and you want to have everyone have an equal opportunity and have the same level playing field. So once you actually hire your candidate that is neurodiverse, neurodivergent is the individual term, and then neurodiverse is the multiple in the group. And so how to empower them once they're in the workplace. So there's a lot of companies that, I've worked with and did workshops for and consulted with, and they were understanding why they weren't getting the productivity out of the neurodiverse individual. And they get having those conversations. Like, are you having a conversation with them? It's just that simple. Sometimes just having that conversation to understand where they're coming from and how they're feeling, And then once you have the conversation, you have to actually listen intently to the neurodiverse employees when they speak. You can't just listen for the sake. You can't just have a conversation with them just to be like, oh, I did have the conversation. But did you actually listen intently and listen to what they want? And so if you don't have a conversation with them, you won't know how they feel about the work, their exact job duties, or how they feel about the work as a whole. And again, and then next point, evaluating the culture. So you won't know how they feel about the culture. And, a lot of culture is not accessible and inclusive to neurodivergent talent. I think it's unintentional, of course, but a lot of companies, they have a certain way of doing things that they didn't realize that it was creating those barriers and creating and not having an inclusive culture towards these employees. They focus so much on the neurotypical employees, sometimes not even on, again, not on purpose, but just by default. And so evaluating how your neurodiverse employees feel about the culture. And there's been studies that if you ask, people how they feel about the culture, especially neurodiverse employees, and you can ask them both in a survey form and ask them just again in the conversation, have that informal approach and having that formal approach. Because when you start evaluating, you can break down those barriers and understand that, okay, a coach needs to improve here. Having ERG groups, it's a hot topic right now, I believe. And, having neurodivergent committees or having diversity committees and having the subgroups within those committees. And it's important to have these committees because it allows people to feel more empowered, feel like they're more connected in the workplace, and you make them feel like they have other people that are like them. And so it's just to evaluate the culture, because sometimes the culture could be toxic to these individuals, but things you can evaluate and change the culture, accommodate based on what they say they need and not what you think they need. A lot of employers, they're like, well, I've worked with another employee that was autistic or had ADHD, so I know how to accommodate you. And that's a downfall. That's a detriment. We've seen that a lot of employers mean well when they say that, because they want to be like, I know how to do this, and they're very excited that they get to help support you in your career and in your jobs. However, it's important to accommodate them how they say they need to be accommodated, because everyone's different, neurodivergent, disabled or not. Everyone has different life experiences, and so it's important to do what they say they need. And then also with that, understanding that accommodation can look very different day to day. If you just again, it's important to stick to accommodation if you have an accommodation plan, but also understanding that accommodation can look very different day to day, because everyone has good and bad days, I always say, and best learning how to accommodate them and their individual needs and what they need that day. For example, someday someone might have more sensory issues and, won't be able to do certain job duties, and so they need noise canceling headphones that day. Meanwhile, other days they might not need that, depending on. But sometimes, some employees need them all the time. Some employees need them sometimes, depending on how they're doing. So just understanding that accommodation is a spectrum as well, and that it can vary day to day. And give them the resources they need to be successful. And so a lot of companies are now investing in accessible equipment and technology, which is incredible, and it's so wonderful. And they're realizing the point of technology for neurodiverse employees. However, sometimes it can be quite costly. And so giving the employee the resources they need to be successful. So having those conversations with them, like, hey, there's this tool, or they would also share with you that there's this tool that they think they can do the work better. And so having them test out the equipment beforehand and giving them the resources they need to be successful. And sometimes the resources is as simple as just having a conversation, or having that reasonable accommodation. It doesn't have to be fancy tech. A lot of companies are trying to, get more on the fancy tech side, but sometimes it's just important just to have those conversations and go back to the basics when empowering. And empowering is all about having that human connection. And a lot of companies are trying to focus on the tech right now, and tech is so important, and we've seen that tech can only go so far. You also have to have that human piece and connect it back to the human that you're working with. So how to create inclusive policies and procedures. So a lot of companies, there's a lot of research out there saying that they don't have disability in the mind when they do the policies and procedures, or neurodivergent employees, neurodiverse employees, when they're doing the policies and procedures. And there's a lot of barriers to policies and procedures. Sometimes the language that's being used, it all goes back to language. When in case studies, there's a lot of issues with language in big corporate worlds, because they want to use big fancy words and feel like they're important. But it goes back to just being human and doing that bare bone approach. And so having these inclusive policies and procedures. So if you don't evaluate your current job policies and procedures, you have to evaluate them for, do they have any barriers or limitations or negative impact on neurodiverse employees in the workplace? If there's been a lot of case studies that have said that these employees usually do suffer from policies and procedures in the workplace because of the language being used, and that they feel like, having a flexible work schedule or work environment, or being flexible. There's a lot of limitations there because you have to have specific work hours, and that could be a barrier and a negative impact. And so a lot of employees, a lot of companies are now having diversity, inclusion, and equity policies. They're mostly focusing on, racism or sexism in the workplace, which is so important. However, they're still not used to focus on people with disabilities, and especially those with neurodivergent, because the policies are realizing, again, a lot of people when they think of disabilities, they think of physical disabilities, but they're missing the neurodivergent individual or neurodiverse individuals in the workplace. So having those policies, and it's beneficial if you have these policies in place, and we're seeing that companies are more likely to innovate more and create more and be more successful and have more productivity if they have these in place, because they're allowing and sharing that they, care about these employees, and that, promotes the participation of different groups of individuals in the workplace, and implementing accommodation policy. And so a lot of companies, they don't have an accommodation policy, and it's important to have that accommodation policy in place. Should be a clear statement of the organization to state their commitment to providing an environment that is inclusive and barrier-free, and to provide accommodations that part of undue hardship. A lot of people, when they think of accommodation, they think of undue hardship. And like I said, there's a lot of reasonable accommodation that can be done. I talk about that more in my workshops, but everyone has the right to have a barrier-free work environment. And when you have that barrier-free work environment, it allows for everyone to succeed. Everyone deserves that, because if you don't have a barrier-free environment, you're creating walls, and you're creating things that people can't do in the workplace. And people should be, well, within reason, but they should be able to do what they want and feel like they don't have any barriers in the way to complete and be successful at work and do the work they want to do. So that concludes my presentation. I'm going to take some questions now, but feel free to email me at accessiblecreates@gmail.com to book a consultation, so we can continue this conversation. It's so important to be a more inclusive employer to neurodiverse and disabled employees. Thank you so much.
Sydney, thank you very much for your presentation. I really see our attendees bombarding us with the questions to you. I don't think we have enough time to ask all of them. I just go by order. Ria Moller-Svanevik, who is a D&I analyst at Danske Bank in Denmark, is asking, what are the best, most needed, and effective accommodations to provide to neurodivergent employees?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, working with them to understand what they need is first and most important, because everyone's different, like I said. And so understanding what they need, but like you can look at simply just changing the job tasks. And so a lot of people, when I say that, they're like, what? Because it's so simple, yet sometimes it's so simple that sometimes I think it's a challenge. But just, if a job task doesn't have to be done, a job duty doesn't have to be done right then and there, it just has to be done before the end of the week. Having changing up the order, because like for a neurodiverse employee that has suffered from trauma, for example, and they're not doing the best today because it's, again, good days and bad days. And so they can't focus on the job tasks that they would normally be able to do. Get them modify their work too, that goes hand in with changing the job tasks and understanding and working with them to see, like, does this work for you? Can we do this today? Or and just changing the job task if it's not urgent, and changing up the way they do things, and having those so another accommodation is just having those frequent breaks, especially working from home or even in the office. It's important to take breaks, but it usually at work there's more scheduled breaks. In the offices, in the actual on-site, there's more scheduled breaks. But at home, you keep going, and there's no real, you take a break and you want to take a break, or but communicating that every, like, 5 minutes at the end of each hour, at the beginning of each hour, I need a 5-minute break before I get back into work. For example, if you have ADHD, sometimes it's hard to focus. And so having those 5-minute breaks just to, have a little break from your computer and then going back and doing the work.
Sydney, thank you so much for answering these questions. We have at least 3 more questions for you in the chat, but don't have time to ask them. If you don't mind, I will send you those questions. You will answer them in writing, and we will post your answers in our social media to continue these important conversations that we have started with you today. So
yes, and if you have any other like the email I just provided, you can feel free to send me an email with your questions at any time.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for sharing your expertise and experience, and we look forward to seeing you around in our next events.
Thank you so much for having me.